This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, we move on to Tina Miller. Tina Miller from Sociology at Oxford Brookes, who will talk to us about the narration of choices around returning to work after becoming a mother.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, thank you very much also for the invitation, and just to say what an absolute pleasure and delight it's been to be engaged with other academics from different disciplines and to listen to and look at different texts sort of outside of where I'd normally be looking for my own research. So it's been really enjoyable. I'm going to try and stick to my paper. I generally ad-lib, so this might be hard, but I'm really going to try just to keep me to the time. I'm a sociologist, and I'm going to be presenting actually some data findings and actually some women's voices, particularly in relation to how they narrate their decisions and choices and negotiations, and all of those things are in quotation marks, so problematic terms, I feel, and I certainly don't feel that we make any choices that are free. I think everything we do is within particular context, historical moments, etc., cultural moments too. Okay, so to start then, changing normative ideas in relation to motherhood, mothering and paid work, and I could add fathering and assumed successful workers, can be a slow process. And so whilst mothers in the UK are increasingly expected to at some level combine caring and paid work, and of course there's a history, we heard a bit about that this morning, they've also been the ones expected to work flexibly, often part-time, fitting their paid work in around family needs. It's also important to note the economic conditions and the precarity currently being experienced, and also the decreased capacity of many families in the UK to be able to exist on a single wage. So we have a lot of couples in couple households trying to earn enough to basically live. Meeting family demands, and so needing to balance work and family life, is most clearly triggered when parenthood is experienced for the first time in such households. This transition can crystallise the gendered division of labour by revealing how policies related to maternal, paternal and parental leave construct caring and paid work norms, and how individual behaviours are enacted within these very particular types of contexts, and we know that there are differences across Europe. Indeed, despite the best of intentions, becoming a parent can reinforce and return individuals to adopt more stereotypically gendered positions, and I wrote a paper that was published in December about that I could talk about later. But this paper will draw upon data from a qualitative longitudinal study undertaken in the UK on women's experiences of transition to first-time motherhood. It will address questions of choice, negotiations, and the decision-making process that women may engage in as they contemplate paid work and maternal caring, and consider the assumptions which persist in the UK in relation to constructions of gendered bodies, capacities, and possibilities. The term work-life balance is used in this paper, but other constructions, work-family balance, family-friendly working, work-family reconciliations, could similarly have been used, and of course there are others. These terms have come to the forefront of the social and policy agenda across Europe and reflect neoliberal discourses of autonomy, individualism and choice. But posing the question of who is actually expected or enabled to work flexibly in the contemporary European context requires that notions of individualism, family lives, policy shifts and societal constructions of motherhood, and in my most recent research fatherhood, are more closely scrutinised. Cross-cutting each of these areas are normative gendered ideas which pattern women's and men's lives, as we saw in the reading part-time. These gendered arrangements are a powerful organising strategy against which historical precedent and associated normative ideals can be difficult and slow to disrupt and change. So reflecting upon the way in which paid work and caring responsibilities are organised at the everyday individual level and family level reveals how entrenched ideas can be, the hard labour, to use Caroline's term, of combining work and caring, falling too often to women. So whilst European policy directives and economic necessity encourage women and mothers' increased participation in the workplace, and we can also see discourses of involved fatherhood being more in evidence, actually realising the changes implied in these directives and discourses can be difficult to achieve at the individual and household level. This is because, amongst other things, the choices and micro-negotiations involved in managing work and family life are not made in a vacuum, nor are they value-free, especially in relation to caring for babies and young dependent children. So as we've seen across part of today, there are significant variations found across Europe in relation to women's lives, working, welfare regimes, policies to support working families, etc. And there are also important cultural and social differences that we need to pay attention to. At the structural level, research across Europe has focused upon taxation policies, childcare facilities, leave arrangements, and the availability of part-time opportunities or women's work in its consideration of how families combine paid work and family life. But less attention has been given to how mothers make and articulate their choices and then rationalise their behaviours in this changing work-life context. So we see change in female employment across Europe, but change across Europe has also been uneven, and commentators have argued that changing normative behaviours can only be achieved in combination with social entitlements, which enable claims to be made for time to care for family members as well as paid work. And I think we're sitting on the edge, if you like, of a sort of caring explosion as we have ageing parents with caring needs, and very often, and it still falls mostly to women, there are changes, are caring at both ends of the spectrum, caring for older parents too. So we're living longer but in poorer health, etc., etc. And I just see this growth of caring needs. So I think there's some really fundamental questions in here. These are the two studies that I've carried out, and in fact I'm just currently going back to the fathers. Their children are now starting school, and looking at their experiences of fathering, collecting later chapters, and I'm also have the resources to go back to the mothers who are now mothering teenage children. So I'm excited about doing that, yeah. Very excited, obviously a lot of work outside of teaching, etc. Anyway, so, and I just want to very quickly say these are longitudinal studies. I followed two cohorts at different times. So the motherhood study happened first, and then the fatherhood study. And they're small scale, but very in-depth, qualitative studies of men's and women's experiences of anticipating and becoming and doing mothering and fathering, labour, work, etc. Through a year with the mothers and 2 years with the fathers so far. I've absolutely exploited my family. It's a picture of my mother on the Motherhood book, and it's my kids sitting in the wheelbarrow in there. So I plan my books around the photos I've got hanging about. Okay, so findings and discussion then. So in the antenatal interviews, both the groups of participants spoke of their intentions to share the caring for the unborn children. And I can say lots about the sample. I haven't got time, so I could always answer questions on that. But the men's intentions particularly were to be there, sharing and caring in ways that they described as equal. They mostly weren't expecting to change their work lives, though, or their working hours, and they also felt a pressure to basically provide, perhaps a bigger house or whatever material needs for their new family at this point. So, but there was this sense that the men were going to be very much involved. But that's in the first interview. The babies haven't been born. So their intentions were absolutely to be there. But in the interviews following the birth, and this is at 6 to 10 weeks after the birth, the most significant difference between the participants in the two studies is that the new fathers have returned to work after 2 weeks paternity leave or holiday leave, and their life continues in quite a sort of a normal way in some respects outside the home, and the mothers are on maternity leave, taking on the primary carer role and becoming very practiced and actually quite good from the partner's perspective anyway, in that role. By the time of the second postnatal interview, so this is at 9 to 10 months, almost all the participants in both studies have returned to some form of paid work. And many of the mothers didn't think that they were going to return to work. They thought that actually what mothers should do was stay at home and do the caring, and I'm going to show you some data on that. So the focus in this paper is then on how this work and caring choices are narrated and rationalised once the baby's been born. And in the motherhood study, where a potential return to paid work is anticipated, the women narrate this in terms mostly of regret, economic necessity, with some reluctance. Not all of them, I'm going to show you an exception. The women's antenatal narratives have conveyed a very clear understanding of what they and wider society consider a good mother to be. So this is them thinking about what they'll do once the baby's born. In an ideal world, I wouldn't go back to work. I've always, before I got married, I always said I felt that a mother should stay at home. And Sarah says, I'd definitely return to work, only part-time, because I think you should, what's the point in having the baby unless you're going to look after it? So trying to do both. And Rebecca, I didn't particularly want my children to go to a childminder or a creche or something. It was very interesting how if you were going to use grandparents, that somehow was a better arrangement or a more acceptable arrangement to them in terms of who would look after the children. So the complex moral and gender terrain against which participants narrate their intentions and experiences become particularly clear as new mothers and new fathers justify their choices around and between returning to paid work and engagement in childcare. At the time of the early postnatal interviews, the new mothers may contemplate a return to work, but they're not back at paid work. Their days are occupied with gradually coming to terms with the work, the job or labour of caring as periods of paternity leave and holiday leave end, etc. A key concern for the fathers returning to work is how on earth is their wife or partner going to manage looking after a child alone, because it's taken them both 24 hours of the day to basically get through those early weeks of new parenting. But what becomes clear through comparing data from the later interviews is that women feel compelled to justify their decisions whether they return to work or not. Whichever way they go, they are having to justify basically their actions. Societal expectations in the UK configure fatherhood differently, and so justifying going to work is completely unnecessary for them, and indeed not working would probably require more justification. But expectations around what women as mothers do or should do are of course more ambiguous, as we know. Okay, so I'm going to move on to this later data. The majority of women in the motherhood study returned to work even if this had not been their expressed intention in the antenatal interviews. The women described their choices and decisions around whether to return to work in tentative and very occasionally more instrumental ways, but the language most generally is very tentative and sort of risking saying things that they think could position them as not being what they think is a good mother. All the women in the motherhood study took responsibility for organising the childcare, sometimes changing their own work hours to part-time and on occasion even their jobs in order to accommodate caring responsibilities. The stress and time pressures they felt on combining working and caring was at times apparent. But so too, this was sort of measured against them wanting to be back in the familiar work environment and saying things like, I miss the office life. So paid work was also equated with self-esteem, regaining a recognisable sense of a pre-baby self. In the following extract we see Rebecca, though, recognising that her own ambitions may be counter to those of societal expectations. I felt as though if I had a job, I was doing something, whereas if I didn't, if I was just at home with a baby, or you're just a mother and a housewife, and I know that's the wrong thing to think, but I still can't help thinking it. So over the first year following the birth, it became clear to both the new mothers and fathers that caring for a baby was hard, but largely undervalued and unexceptional, as they reported at work. Aspects of which could be enjoyable and rewarding, but which was evaluated differently to real work outside the home. Another mother, Abigail, talked of her need to be a professional person again, invoking the workplace as a different realm in which to be a social actor and in which to achieve. In the following extract, she draws upon language more traditionally associated with masculine worker identities, I do like being a professional person and myself. I really felt by the end of my maternity leave that I was treading water and the whole world was getting on with their lives and mine was on hold. Even if I was achieving something with the baby, I didn't feel it was enough for me. That might sound selfish, I don't know. I felt so trapped by the end of my maternity leave. I felt so isolated. Although Abigail implies that her sense of self and identity as a professional person has become submerged into the role as mother during her maternity leave, she also recognises that this might sound selfish. This might not be a way that you expect a mother to talk about choosing between caring and paid work. But justifying choices to work on a full-time caring rather than working, justifying choices to take on full-time caring, to stay at home rather than working, was not something that the fathers mostly had to do. However, the mothers who do not return to work felt they did have to justify this. So here Faye is talking about feeling a bit guilty about not going to work, and so the sort of not being able to win whichever way you go. I know, I've worked for a long time, but sort of you feel a bit out of the world in a way because you're not getting up every day and going to work and the normal things, But I mean, we wanted to have a baby. We've been together for a long time. We didn't rush into it or anything. So, there's no point in having them and then palming them off on other people. I don't know if this is just a UK, sort of perception of what childcare is like. But Sarah too wants to talk about, surely though this is, what she's doing is also hard work. You just put too much pressure on yourself. Surely this mothering is a job. But I don't see the point in working to pay someone else to look after your child. I think mothering full time, does drive you mad. There were all sorts of ambiguities and contradictions going on, particularly in Sarah's account. Okay, I'm going to move on swiftly. Really, the idea of paying someone else to look after your child was sort of seen as something that, as problematic, basically, and as I say, could very well refer to the sort of childcare we have or don't have here, and the high costs of what we have got. In the motherhood study, though, Claire, who's a school teacher, is the first one to return to work when her child is just 13 weeks old, and she talks about the nightmare and how stressful it is putting care in place, and then she describes about actually what they've organised. And it's just exhausting. We had a friend, she did Monday and Tuesday, then my next door neighbour did Wednesday and Friday. She's got a 1.5-year-old and she's quite happy with a bit of extra money, and and I was really happy to leave her and glad that she could do that, and my mum could have him on Thursday. We thought about nurseries, but we thought maybe he was just a bit too young there, because he likes the one-to-one, and it was just this sort of absolute exhaustion of putting in place these really precarious caring arrangements and then going off to a full-time job around this. So just enormous difficulties, I think. Okay, so I'm going to jump on just a little bit, but just to point up another difference, and this is between the two studies and how the mothers and fathers could talk about emphasising the quality of the caring that they did do when they were with the children. So the mothers who did return full-time really felt that they had to narrate this really intensive, high-quality mothering that they were doing when they weren't at work. So Claire says, but I mean, I think the time we do have with him, the baby, we just make a real effort, because we don't, everything is him. We don't do anything else. When he's awake, we're just around him, and at the weekends we're with him like all day, and we make a big effort. So it's not enough to say I'm working and I'm exhausted at the weekend and I do as good a job as I can. You've got to be doing this, this is the intensive, the good mother. And, she goes to a nursery and she absolutely loves it. And, it's really genuinely a good thing for her. I can drop her off, etc., etc. So there's a lot of work going on to just explain how much they're doing in terms of still being a good, doing good mothering at the opportunities that they have in order to do that. Okay. I've just put Philippa in here, and I'll almost end with her. I'll just make a few concluding comments. But Philippa is quite interesting because she actually produces a different type of narrative that is much more the type of narrative I found amongst the men, which is about her own progression, her own career progression, etc. And actually saying she didn't find mothering stimulating enough. Well, not for her anyway. You know, I don't think, you know, I don't really know whether I'd be good at it or not. I need to do both anyway. So she did a lot of trying to sort of start to articulate the fact I like my job, and my colleagues depend on me, and I have a job and work that I'm committed to. Okay, so just a few concluding points here, and I've really had to cut this up. I think what's of interest here in Philippa's account is that she articulates herself as a career woman and a mother. She does not produce what would be recognised as a narrative of selfless motherhood, but one which is much more associated with autonomy, my career trajectory and individual control, using language that has been much more historically associated with hegemonic masculinities. And even though we see some reticence at first to talk about this, Philippa then launches into it. So I think across Europe, women still do more domestic and caring work everywhere. In the UK, policies related to maternal and paternal leave and parental leave have consequences for how norms and individual behaviours are culturally perceived and enacted. There is change afoot here. But as is also clear, policies alone are not enough, and clearly there's sort of cultural shifts, etc., which have to occur, and the complex relationships between policies, normative and gendered societal expectations, and individual intentions and practices requires further scrutiny. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.